Let's begin somewhere called ancient history, right?
Yeah.
Now, throughout history, all cultures have had a story about how human beings were created, right? All of them. The most recent story, I'm sure most of you might be familiar with, is, the Bible. Yeah, the most recent one, but there are older versions. So the most popular one is the Greek story of creation, how the Greek gods created human beings. So they created human beings who were apparently sexually ambiguous. They were neither male nor female, right? And they lived on for some years until one day, some other god by the name Prometheus, god of knowledge and mischief, decided to whisper a few cosmic secrets in their ears. He told them that, I have some water upstairs. Sorry. This god whispered a few secrets in their ears and told them actually they were gods themselves because they were created in the image of the gods that created them. When they heard this, they realized, wait, we could also be gods and overthrow these gods in what was then called Mount Olympus, right? Mount Olympus today is known as what? Heaven, right? Okay. So they decided to wage a war against their creators. So in the process of going to war to dethrone those gods to become gods themselves, what the Father Creator did was he split them using lightning into two, male and female, so that they would spend the rest of their lives seeking each other out to become one, right? For unity, as opposed to like worrying about becoming gods. Now this narrative trickles down through history and finds its way through into the Bible. The Bible is another version of what I just told you. So originally when Jesus created human beings, he first created the first man, right? And I do that intentionally, man, because the word is it wasn't used in the sense that we use it today. So he created Adam, and then later on, realizing that Adam was lonely, decided to create a woman out of Adam's ribs, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you what this is supposed to mean, but when you read it, if you are able to understand the original story, then this one is really literally a stone's throw away to understand. But now, what does it say about Adam if another being in the form of a woman can be taken out of his, of his ribs? Keep that in mind. Hold on to that thought. Now, moving on down through the ages, culturally, there have been, transgenderism is really not a new concept. It's not new to human beings. Throughout most cultures, for instance, I'll make another example. The first example I'll make is of Greek cultures. So, ancient cultures used to have multiple gods, what we call, they tended to be polytheistic. They didn't just have one god. So they had different varieties of gods for different things. Some of them still retain this, like the Hindus, for instance. So what they did was, for certain gods, there were certain gods, for instance, Cybele, certain gods, goddesses were worshipped, right, by certain Greeks. And when they did this, the men would dress in women's garments and put on makeup and earrings and what have you. And in the heat of what you call possession cults, what some women would do as a sort of homage, a form of worship, is they would cut off their genitals as a sort of castration. It's actually not really rare. What we call eunuchs today, those men who used to be, sometimes it was done voluntarily or involuntarily because they were either taken as slaves somewhere in Africa to guard what you call harems or sanctuaries in some country's empire. The other example of transgenderism, and not as we know it, is the idea of what white settlers call two-spirited people. Now, when white settlers would come to a country and take over, its lands like they did with Africa, what they would do is they would have people who would study that particular people's cultures, what you call ethnographers, or today we call them anthropologists. And what they found out is they discovered individuals who were neither he or she in the way that they were referred to in their cultures. They were ambiguous, sexually, and they were still part of the whole cultural system. They were actually quite respected. in some cultures, they were known to be or believed to possess spiritual or shamanistic abilities, or what we today probably would know as the same kind of power we endow amateja, same abilities. So for instance, when a child was born, a newborn was born into a household, they would be called on to give them blessings. Okay? And then another example of cultural transgenderism existing throughout cultures is the concept of the Igbo concept of the Ogbanje. Ama Igbo or Nigerians is an ethnicity in Nigeria. So these people, and Ogbanje, loosely translated in English, is what they call spirit children. So it's a child who's born into a family and then dies, and then is reborn again in that family. And he does it generally when they are born, they never live for too long. The whole point of them is to die. And when they do live to be adults, they tend to be treated differently by people because they're not really human beings. They are, but kind of spirits in their rawest form, but expressing themselves as human beings. There are examples of this, but I'm not going to go into those because I have 10-15 minutes. But the idea here is that these creatures, or these human beings, tend to be very sexually ambiguous. They don't identify as either male or female. For instance, if one is born a female, the tendency is that they tend to remove all of their female organs, including their uterus and whatnot, because they don't want to give birth. And generally, in Nigeria, they're not advised to give birth because they don't want to perpetuate that spirit, because they don't want it. Yes, they don't want it. Moving along, transness in South Africa. So, like I said, globally, trans identity has never been new. The earliest records, for instance, of gender reassignment and gender, or what we call today gender, gender reassignment, gender affirmation, it happened in the 1900s in Germany, not in 1960, as the US would like to claim, because they think they have all the world, firsts. But anyway, in South Africa, for instance, apart from pre-colonial accounts of gender non-conforming sexualities, the mines of the gold rush in the 1800s also have the earliest accounts of transactivity. So, for instance, the idea of a boy wife is very popular. The idea, during the gold rush, when black men would have to, move to Gauteng and, to work in the mines, women were generally not allowed. So a dynamic occurred there where those men would either have relations with young boys who behaved like women and dressed like them, even wore prosthetics and all of these things. It still happens to this day, even with the whole mine hostels being opened, but it also happened then, it still happens to this day, right? So the concept of boy wives happened where boys play out this kind of heteronormative dynamic between the one who's working in the mine and then they take care of the home. Yes, of course, in the military is the most scandalous one, because the apartheid military. Now, the apartheid military is notorious for being homophobic, and yet, interesting enough, you find an account of trans identity. Actually, if anything, they were pro-trans people, because the idea here, for instance, in 1974, the National Party passed a law called the Births, Deaths and Marriage Registration Act 51 of 1974, where people who identify as transgender could be reassigned, right, or affirmed surgically. And of course, there was a catch. The catch was the government then, when they discussed this law, they thought reassigning someone into their preferred gender dispelled homosexuality. Okay. The idea was to get rid of homosexuality because they were really against it. So they thought if they could change someone or give someone their preferred sex, then it would, get rid of their homosexuality. What they didn't know, of course, was the fact that there's a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, right? We know that now. Okay. Of course, media representations of trans people in South Africa, they tend to be very scarce, mostly because Tina, we were dealing with other things like apartheid, for instance, and our lives were not really. Other things were more, prominent when television came, to this country. Elsewhere in the world, for instance, in antebellum America, which is antebellum means pre-Civil War, that is 1834, 35, 1840s, 1850s. Whenever black people, so this was after they were slavery was abolished. So whenever black people were presented in newspapers, they were always presented as a joke. An example of this, the two prominent characters in American history, two individuals. One was Lucy Hicks Anderson and Mary Jones. And these individuals came out in newspapers in their day because they were trying to make a living, and they did so through sex work.
Okay.
Because at the time, after slavery was abolished, in some states it wasn't, so people needed to find a way, to kind of
make a living.
So that's that. And then, like I said, in South Africa, the earliest, I think, incident, or the most abundant one of media representations of trans identity is what they call the 1966 Forest Town raid, which was a raid that took place in a bar or club where there was apparently a drag queen pageant, right? And at the time, of course, because the apartheid police were very anti-homophobic, anti-gay, everything. So these people were taken and incarcerated, put into prison, because apparently the pageant they were doing, which wasn't harming anyone, was said to be an aberration, something that could not be tolerated by the government. That's the most. But then this involved white people. You might notice also in this presentation, there aren't many white people. I avoided that because most of trans history is very white. Most recorded one is very white. I tried to avoid it, and it's quite interesting how frustrating putting this together, because I was tired of the white faces because there aren't any black trans bodies. And then today, just to round up, today our most pressing issues in the community are the stigma, violence and murder of trans bodies, lack of education, access to services, and the emphasis on the language used to explain what it means. I'm gonna take these 2 points, the lack of education and emphasis on the language, and tie them to safe spaces, the idea of safe spaces. Now, the lack of education is actually an interesting, can I curse? No?
Express yourself.
Okay. It's a mindfuck for me, honestly, because people always say, people need to be educated so that we know about it. I'm like, what rock have you been living under? In 2020, when people have smartphones and access to everything, it's a mystery to me that you find people who behave like they don't know. Maybe you don't know certain things, but come on. The idea of standing in front of people, because my whole thing in life has been is this thing of avoiding explaining yourself to people. Because people see whatever they want to see. In rural areas, they've always been aware of certain things, and they've always been treated, or they've always found a way to incorporate certain kinds of people into the community. And then you move, centuries later into, we move into suburbs, into urban areas where you find that, the likelihood of people of queer identity being violated is in urban settlements where people are supposed to be more, quote unquote, woke, right? Begs the question exactly what's going on. I've always been trying to figure that, because I've always assumed that when we move to cities we are better at understanding things than people. Apparently that's not the case. So as a final point this presentation, I'm very interested in the future and present histories of trans identities, in the sense that I feel history is not a straight line, right? It has a way of, it's always, it's present and it's future. So I don't want to say anything cliche about where we're going, because it's open to whatever, or to the next generation. But I'm glad we're in a privileged position in this country, where we live in a country that has a constitution that is as open as ours, unlike most of the continent. And I think, for me, without bogging you down in the terminology and the kind of academics of it all, I think for me, I've always thought one way in which the queer community could really feel it is loved is if Africans learn to love themselves first, because I think there's something going on with Africans that I just can't put my finger on. It has nothing to do with the community. It's the people themselves. Look at, for instance, townships, what's going on there. Like, whenever you hear ethics, it's always townships, the shantiest ones. Wonder why. It has nothing, all prejudices have nothing to do with the object of the prejudice, it's the subject, the person inciting it. So, yeah, that's my little 20 cents from the history.